Hello, and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum, the show where two or more political scientists do their level best to explain the post-war order first to ourselves and then hopefully to you. As always, I am your host, Steve Palley. With me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. Galen, how are you this fine Thursday? What's going on?
Good, man. NBA playoffs have been pretty solid, and we are now entering the first of the 2 good months of weather that we get in New England annually.
Yeah. So, are you through mud season?
Are we ever? Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Not really.
I guess. Sure, we'll say yes.
Okay. Yeah, as regards the playoffs, how are you feeling about the Knicks? Do you think the Knicks can win it all?
Look, if you had asked me like last week, I would have said no.
Hmm.
I still don't think that they will, but
Hmm.
I'm now at like call it 2-1 against whoever they play. But that means they've got a 1-3 shot.
I
But
like those odds.
they've won 11 straight playoff games. The only 2 losses they've had have been by 1 point. I'll probably be rooting for them because I think that team is super likable.
Totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
they've got Mike Brown. Hard to dislike Mike Brown as coach, former coach of my Sacramento Kings. I'd rather not go further into that right now. It's very painful. But I think that team is peaking at the right time while San Antonio and Oklahoma City are beating the crap out of each other. Those teams are like injured in
Yeah.
significant ways. And so whoever gets through, maybe OKC closes it out tonight in San Antonio. I kind of think it'll go 7, but
I
we'll
think it's
see.
going to go 7-2. I think
Yeah,
OKC in 7.
but the Knicks are just chilling, man. They're resting up. They look ready. So I actually think it's kind of a coin flip for
I
that
mean,
reason.
even better odds. I mean, I think it'll be super cool. Like I said, I think a lot of guys on that team are pretty great.
Yeah,
Um, and you're right. It's sort of like like Game of Thrones, where you guys deal with the White Walkers and knock yourself out. We'll be waiting for the final battle.
exactly. We'll be waiting to mop up, right?
Yeah,
And yeah, at this point, I can never discount or sleep on Brunson to do amazing things. So
I love that guy. I mean, I feel like everyone's being accused of flopping these days. Uh, anyway, I don't care. That guy's
yeah,
super clutch. Love his footwork. Love his game. Love his the whole way he plays. So
yeah,
yeah, that'll
I'm
be
with you.
fun, man.
Yeah, cool. All right. So the Western Conference finalists are beating each other up. The United
I
States and Iran have been beating each other up
I knew
in
it
the
was
Persian
coming.
Gulf. Yeah, we're going back to Iran, but not really so much to talk about the Iran war, which I think is winding down. I'm not sure if you believe that.
Depends on how one defines the U.S.-Iran war.
Yeah,
Uh,
fair enough.
in terms of
Just
like active combat operations, I think that's probably correct. Although we should say there have been some
There have been some flare-ups.
changes of fire in
Yeah,
recent days, but none of the major items that caused the war in the first place have been addressed. And so, in that sense,
zero.
this is
Goose egg.
yeah, another chapter in the story. And down the road, I suspect the outcome of this exchange will probably lead any future US president to be more reluctant. On the other hand, because exactly zero of these issues have been addressed,
Hmm.
we'll have to see.
Yeah, the deal that may or may not get signed amounts to a slow backing away from the Strait of Hormuz by both sides, a relief of the blockades, the inner and the outer blockade, the inner being perpetrated by Iran, the outer being perpetrated by the United States, and then an agreement to start negotiating nuclear issues from there. We will not get regime change. We will not get, guarantee not to attack the rest of the Persian Gulf. The missile issue remains unresolved. The militia issue remains unresolved. And we'll see what happens with the nuclear issue. Who knows?
I think it's just going to get kicked down the road.
Probably, yeah. To me, this doesn't even represent a return to status quo ante for the U.S., it's worse than that because Iran has been emboldened and empowered and shown that it has strike capabilities against the entire region. It has wrecked a lot of U.S. hardware and bases. It has hit Israel. It has hit the Gulf Emirates. It has shut down the Strait of Hormuz, most importantly, and imposed economic costs. And we could do nothing about any of that, at least at a cost that we were willing to pay. So we are starting to read editorials calling this a loss for the United States, chalking one up for the L column for the United States. Now, I think you and I, basically a few weeks after this thing kicked off, were like, this is on a bad trajectory. It's looking like a loss. Journalists are starting to follow along. And in fact, some op-ed writers are starting to refer to this as potentially the United States' Suez moment, referring to the Suez crisis of 1956. And we thought that was kind of a useful frame because what that is typically taken to mean is the beginning of the end or even the death knell of a country's great power status. Right, Galen? So we wanted to take that because, like, that's actually a pretty strong claim to make. And if you want to get attention, like, that's the kind of claim that you want to make in an op-ed. It's the Suez crisis. Oh, man, that's bad. We wanted to quickly jump into that and discuss, first of all, like what the Suez crisis even was. It was in the neighborhood a long time ago.
Yeah.
A really long time ago at this point, 70 years. So talk about that and talk about whether we believe this situation, this loss, or, absolute best case scenario, in my opinion, this draw with the Islamic Republic of Iran represents a Suez moment for the United States.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think neither of us agree with that analogy, and I'll turn it over to you to explain why. Try to just keep this brief because the Suez crisis is actually pretty complex, and I don't want to get derailed by going into nitty gritty. But the key players involved are Israel, France, and Britain on one side, and Egypt, led at the time by a guy named Gamal Abdel Nasser on the other. So what was this all about? Well, Nasser was this extremely charismatic, forceful figure in the politics of the Arab world in the 1950s and 1960s, who was seen as kind of the leading proponent of what was called pan-Arab nationalism, leader of the Arab socialist states, basically. And for a few reasons, the British, French, and the Israelis really do not like this guy. On the Israeli side, there's a few things going on. Egypt is not letting shipping go through the Strait of Tiran that leads to Israel's southern shipping terminus. So this is like making it difficult for the Israelis to import supplies. The Egyptians are allowing cross-border Palestinian Fedayeen raids to occur from their territory. But kind of at its heart, the Israelis are worried about the balance of power shifting against them. Egypt has struck a major arms deal with the Soviet Union. And so they're worried about Egypt kind of dominating the Arab world and eventually turning its sights on Israel directly. And they kind of want to get the Egyptians before they're able to build up militarily. The British and French are a little bit different. There's certain factors like Nasser is sort of providing some support to the Algerian rebels who are fighting the French. So the French don't have a lot of nice things to say about him for that reason. But the main factor here is that Nasser does something that infuriates both of them, and that's he nationalizes the Suez Canal, which previously had kind of been dominated by the British and French. And London and Paris see this as like a direct threat to their great power status, their prestige, their credibility. The British Prime Minister at the time, Anthony Eden, repeatedly makes comparisons, to 1930s appeasement of Hitler, talks in terms comparing Nasser to Mussolini. I think the French say that the nationalization of the canal is similar to the remilitarization of the Rhineland, a key moment in Nazi Germany's rearmament in 1936.
Big rhetoric. Big
Yeah,
rhetoric.
yes, like major dramatic claims. And basically, like, they're saying this guy's got to go.
Hmm.
Now, the plan they come up with is like pretty piss poor. Like, it's another one of these circumstances. It bears repeating every time it happens, where like you can have all the military success in the world you want. If it is divorced from political considerations, you're in big trouble.
Hmm.
So the plan is basically the Israelis are going to invade in the canal zone. And there's this provision in the Suez Canal Treaty that the British and French are allowed to intervene in emergencies that threaten the canal. And so they're going to use this as a pretext, basically, to intervene, to reopen the waterway. Militarily, things go off pretty well. They made one big mistake, which was they kept the Americans in the dark.
Oops.
They do this at the very end of October 1956. So this is like a week before President Dwight Eisenhower's reelection night. And he's very upset that this is coming at a delicate time in American electoral politics. They also do it while the Soviet Union is putting down a major uprising in Hungary. And this diverts the world's attention away from what's going on in Eastern Europe and puts it directly on the Middle East in a very unflattering way. Eisenhower was very worried about the Cold War consequences of this because he was worried it would appear that this was kind of a return of European colonialism to the Middle East. And the reason he was worried about that is because it was.
Yes.
And so Eisenhower ultimately puts enormous pressure on the Israelis and the British and French, the Israelis to withdraw their forces from the Sinai Peninsula and the Canal Zone. The Israelis come out a little bit better than the other powers do for reasons I won't go into, but uses massive economic leverage to punish the British and French and get them to withdraw. And so this is seen as like a death knell for Britain and France as great powers, kind of the last gasp of the two major European imperial powers. And so to call what's happening in the Middle East now America's Suez moment is a major claim and is basically positing, I guess you could say maybe in the Middle East specifically, this is the last gasp of, U.S. leadership in the region. We're more boldly kind of ending U.S. great power status. So
Hmm.
I don't think you or I are willing to go that far.
Yes. And here is why it's not the best analogy. For one thing, if we fast forward to 2026 and the situation in the Persian Gulf right now, there is no analog to the United States for the United States in this story. In 1956, it was already the case that Britain and France were junior partners to the United States. This had been cemented by the situation in World War II when France was occupied and partially destroyed. Same goes with the United Kingdom. Both countries were in the process of losing their colonial empires. Both countries were up against it economically. France had started to fight what amounted to a colonial war in Algeria. I don't know if maybe that was a little bit later, but it was losing its possessions to begin with. So what this really did was ratify a loss that had already happened, right? And the United States, as the senior partner in the allied relationship, put its stamp on that. They were able to coerce these little guys, basically. It's like you can't do that, and if you try, we will bankrupt you. And that was a credible threat because they could sell a ton of sovereign debt, especially for the UK, and just instant recession.
Basically wreck the British pound was what they
Exactly.
threatened to do.
Yeah. There is no country really able to play that role vis-a-vis the Iran situation for the United States in 2026. Sure, there's lots of holders of U.S. sovereign debt, but they're not selling it. They're not threatening coercion. There was some talk of that among the Arabs earlier in the war, I guess. Didn't happen. Just mutterings, right? But yeah, there is no senior partner to the United States. I had thought the Chinese might step in and try to do more to bring the conflict to an end because they do have leverage over both sides. But they decided to keep their powder dry and mostly just say, "Hey, we think this is a bad idea and we really want it to stop." So they've played a role in facilitating dialogue between the U.S. and Iran, but they haven't done any arm twisting, at least that we're aware of. So that's one reason why this analogy doesn't make a lot of sense. Another reason is simply that the United States still retains a ton of capability. It's still a military superpower. Now, this conflict has actually degraded America's military posture in a real way, particularly in the Middle East, and we'll get into that, right? But I don't think it represents a last gasp in any way, shape, or form in terms of the United States being able to project power in the Persian Gulf or anyplace else. Now, it may be the case that the U.S. doesn't want to project military power in the Persian Gulf anymore. That could be a result of this loss, or it could be a result of just policy change, as reflected in the national security strategy, which I think assigns the Middle East a priority of, third out of 5 or 6 regions, something like that. They want to keep their powder dry for East Asia. That was the whole idea, and outsource security to Israel and the Gulf monarchies, partners in the Persian Gulf to balance Iran. This conflict represented a departure from that strategy, but the U.S. could return to that strategy and just be like, okay, we're done here. We don't need to do this. So it's not really existential in the same way. That being said, I do think it is important. We agree that it's important to analyze what this loss is going to do to the United States and exactly how big of a disaster this loss is. Is it a gigantic disaster? Is it a large disaster? Or is it actually more moderate, something that the United States can and will come back from? So if it's not a Suez moment, what kind of moment is it? And I think we know enough now to be able to at least begin having that discussion.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I guess I want to build on something you said earlier, which I thought was pretty spot on, which is like the Suez Crisis happens in 1956. So we are a decade or so into the Cold War, which is universally seen as a bipolar conflict, which by definition means there are only 2 great powers in the system. Neither of them was France or Britain. They're important countries. They certainly played a key role during the Cold War period, but that alone, I think, makes this a pretty different situation than 1956. Like you read stuff Churchill writes about World War II, where he's at conferences with the Soviets and Americans, and suddenly the British Empire feels very, very small, right? The Truman Doctrine was precisely because the British say, hey, we can no longer play the role that we used to play in the Eastern Mediterranean, right?
Yeah, Cyprus, right?
Yeah.
In particular.
So I just don't think that analogy holds up very well for that reason alone. To the question you just asked, I would distinguish potentially between like the Middle East specifically and more globally. In the Middle East, I think there's a lot that has to shake itself out, but potentially the repercussions could be pretty severe. I think we've talked many times already and are still waiting to see what's going to happen in terms of whether some states start diversifying their foreign policies or altering, their orientation and start seeking other outside aid or turning away from the United States, right? If you compare where things are in 2026 to right after the 1991 Persian Gulf War, things are very stark. At that time, the United States was like clearly the preeminent power in the region, and everyone was going to pay a price for crossing the Americans. Since then, a lot has happened. The U.S. has fought and lost 2 large wars. Afghanistan's not right in the Middle East, but sort of nearby. The Iraq War has been a major disaster. It has really strengthened Iran. We've had a total breakdown of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. So the U.S. position going into this conflict wasn't exactly awesome.
I would argue that as a result of those disasters, our threats or capability to launch ground operations in Iran were not credible. Like both of us thought,
Yeah.
like anything Trump would say about, oh, like we're going to take over this, we're going to take over that, we're going to go to Tehran. It's like, no, you're not. Like nobody believed that.
Which was why they felt comfortable restarting their uranium enrichment program in the first place back
Mm-hmm.
in the mid 2000s once they saw the U.S. had bogged down in Iraq. Now you look at kind of the scorecard of where things are now. It is important to say the Iranians have taken huge losses. I think we're probably going to learn even more about that, but the target set was so enormous and the economic damage has been so severe. It's going to take a while for them to recover. But the outstanding facts of the situation, as I see them, leaving, even noting that point, are the regime is still standing.
Hmm.
They still control the Strait of Hormuz, and it doesn't look like we have a great set of ideas as to how to address that situation.
We never ended up doing any escorts. We didn't doing anything much militarily to
Yeah,
try to stop that.
we talked about before, they still have the vast majority of their ballistic missiles. And the nuclear file remains completely where it was prior to the start of the war. And to boot, this has further estranged the United States from many of its allies. And it seems, based on the polls I've seen, that the war is becoming increasingly unpopular within the United States, though one must account for political polarization. I do think there's kind of a hard floor on how low that support can go.
I think people are
Um,
starting to connect it to rising prices as they
yeah,
should.
so if you view it in those terms, and you also are concerned, as I am, about what a nuclear Iran would mean,
Mhm.
yeah, the consequences seem to be stark. But even there, the US remains one of the main players in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And so I don't view it as a death knell in the Middle East. I'll hold off on, more globally for now. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. So, like in terms of like, you know, kinetically what actually happened during this war. We struck with the Israelis 15,000 plus targets, whatever, in Iran.
So many
Iran,
targets.
yeah, we actually depleted a bunch of our offensive and defensive capabilities in order to do that. Particularly the defensive capabilities, particularly the interceptors. Some of our interceptors are down, 30 to 50% as a result of this conflict, trying to protect our allies, which we were able to do imperfectly. We got to 90 to 95% protection. It wasn't 100%. So our allies were not that happy. you know, it's like some of these drones and ballistic missiles the Iranians use, they can take out entire city blocks. So when you're talking about that type of situation, it's like you don't really want to get to 90 to 95%. You kind of want to get pretty close to
Yeah.
100%. Couldn't do it. And we spent a lot of munitions trying to get there. And then, yeah, we just pummeled these guys with all different kinds of precision munitions, tomahawks, and what are they called? Jazzimers, I think. We have all these different acronyms for precision munitions, and we burned up a bunch of these rockets, just taking out these targets. And it's like, it's funny. It's like we hit them very successfully, but we kind of tired ourselves out doing it. In addition, the Iranians struck a lot of military hardware on the ground for the United States. They struck many of our most important bases, rendering some of them unusable for some period of time. They blew up some very valuable radars and aircraft, including AWACS aircraft. So it's not like they were unable to lay a hand on us. They actually hit our assets in the Middle East, our physical assets. That's a problem when it comes to readiness, right? All this is a problem. At a minimum, it's going to take us probably a couple years to rebuild those bases, refresh those munitions. And in the meantime, should Iran want to fight some more, should the Chinese or the Russians want to go in those other theaters, we're just not going to be as prepared to do it, right?
Well, they did two other things, I would argue. One is they successfully showed US partners in the Middle East that
Yes.
that alignment might be a liability
Yeah.
cases.
Do
Now,
you even want these bases, right? Because they just kept connecting it to there are attacks coming from these bases. We're going to attack the bases. You're
now
harboring the bases.
I don't
We're
know
going to
what's going to
attack you.
happen with that. Like in
Yeah.
general, I don't think countries like being attacked. So who knows? Maybe that will lead to further balancing against Iran by
So
some of these places. And
let's
we go ahead.
let's talk about the idea of balancing versus bandwagoning,
Yeah.
because like I think this is like one of the key theoretical points, and it's a theory from security studies and international relations. It's not a complicated theory, right? It's balancing versus bandwagoning. Balancing is there's somebody big and bad in the neighborhood. You all get together to try to fight that guy and deter them, right? So you have the Arabs and the Israelis lining up with the United States against Iran because Iran has a lot of malign capability and malign intent. That's balancing. Bandwagoning occurs when you switch sides and you actually go over to the bad guys because balancing doesn't work very well sometimes. You're actually not getting the protection that you thought you would get from the other camp. So it's like, if you can't beat them, join them.
Yeah.
That's bandwagon.
Now, one of the concerns about the Middle East is that so balancing is always less efficient than theoretically it should be, or at least tends to happen more slowly than you would think would be ideal, right?
Mm-hmm.
One concern about the Middle East is, well, look at all of the fissures between the countries who, in theory, would be balancing against Iran, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you obviously had the Arab-Israeli conflict, like the ultimate wedge. And we saw with the Abraham Accords, which for reasons that escape me, Trump is now calling on the region to expand at a
Not a
time
good time.
that would be the least likely outcome I could possibly imagine.
Yeah, not a
Um,
good time for that.
but you know, those led to normalization of relations between Israel on the one hand and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain on the other. Without a settlement of the Palestinian issue, that is a potent wedge, certainly among Arab publics, among the Arab states themselves. You know, we've talked before about how the UAE and Saudi Arabia have had some tensions in recent years. Qatar has had tensions with all of these countries in the
Mm-hmm.
past. Turkey, not an Arab country, but also has not been on the best of terms with some of these places. You have these transnational identities that can drive further wedges. So, you know, Iraq is a majority Shia country that neighbors Saudi Arabia, like the leading Sunni power. So, and then of course you have all these Iranian proxies and militia groups spread across the region that complicates things further. So the concern is balancing might not be terribly efficient. And that's even leaving aside the fact that a lot of these countries don't necessarily have the most potent military forces,
Mm-hmm.
with some exceptions. So there's that question. And to me, it's still open what the outcome of the war is in that regard. And the second thing that I think Iran showed, or at least called into question, I'll call it the 21st century American way of war,
Mm-hmm.
which is the United States does not like putting boots on the ground, going back to Vietnam and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars reinforced that. Americans do not like high casualties, as they should not, and they do not like long drawn out conflicts without decisive ends. The US prefers to do things like fight with high technology or fight an economic war or an industrial war. That's where the US traditionally has done very well. I'm not saying the United States couldn't alter its way of war, but I don't see Americans supporting that unless the stakes are really high. And certainly they're not going to support doing it in this case. And what that means is that a country like Iran that thrives on asymmetric tactics and, you know, getting the most bang for its buck, as we've talked about with some of these cheaper drones, leveraging its, you know, mosquito fleet in the Strait of Hormuz, kind of puts that model of warfare, at least makes it more questionable about how effective it can be on some of these conflicts. So I
Yeah,
would put that in the L column as well.
you're right, and like I think you're right. I think this country the US is unlikely to ever reinstate conscription or have another draft, which is kind of what major ground operations would take, right? We did it in Iraq and Afghanistan, but one could very easily make the argument that those ground operations weren't major enough. Right.
And certainly there was not conscription.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, if you actually want to do this right, you probably, analyses at the time are like at a minimum 500,000 people in the
Correct.
region if you want to actually do the World War II thing, right?
Yeah,
And we
and
were
can I
like,
just really quickly on that, because the first Persian Gulf War always gets held up as like this was the moment where the world saw what American high technological warfare and stuff like PGMs and electronic warfare and stuff like that can do. That's all true to a certain extent. I think the United States had over 500,000 troops
yeah,
deployed to Saudi Arabia to fight that war on the ground. And that was just to expel forces from Kuwait, not to actually invade and occupy Iraq. So even that case, I think, is somewhat misleading.
and indeed, like the first Gulf War went incredibly well, but at the time, the thinking was that the U.S. would probably suffer tens of thousands of casualties as a result of that fight. And so we were prepared for it. We're not prepared to do anything like that anymore, unless, yeah, we're in a full on like World War III situation, and we have to protect the homeland or something like that. Like it would basically take some World War II type situation. By the way, even like getting the U.S. into World War II was non-trivial.
Yes. And then the US Army demobilized rapidly once the war was
Yes.
over. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we have that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, if Americans can't put gas in the truck, that's a big problem. We don't like that. And so yeah, it's yeah, we had both of those things happening at the same time here.
Yeah. Well, so, okay. I want to ask your thoughts on this. My view, so that's the Middle East. I think
Yeah.
the United States already had an Iran problem, and we
Hmm.
can debate, in terms of American national security and grand strategy, how big that problem was and remains. But per your earlier point, I think if anything, like the deck has shifted somewhat in Iran's favor. So
They
that
have a
problem,
bigger Iran problem now. I agree with that.
yes. So there's that.
Yeah.
But the US isn't finished as a power in the Middle East.
No, and so why are we in the Middle East, right? In the first place, why do we build all these bases? The idea was we want to stop any one country from dominating the oil. One country is sort of dominating the oil by preventing its outflow,
Yeah.
which we were extremely concerned about for a long time. On the other hand, particularly after the Arab oil embargoes and things like that, right? On the other hand, even Iran is not able to completely choke it off. And you and I think we've talked about this. We both think that control of the Strait of Hormuz is actually a wasting asset.
Yeah. And when we had Pasha on a few weeks ago, he was saying
Yeah.
this is going to accelerate transition to other forms of energy. Yeah.
And even aside from that, it's like countries will find workarounds and build new pipelines. So a decade from now, it's like, will the Strait of Hormuz be as big of a deal as it is right now? Probably not. But it's like there's leverage there right now. So yeah, we have to repair these bases and restock, and then figure out some way to do business with Iran or coexist with Iran with our allies, right? If we're not going to quote unquote finish the job, then we have to coexist. And
So,
that, yeah,
yeah, I mean, you asked why is the United States in the Middle East, which I think is a good question worth spelling out explicitly. Like during the Cold War, the three things that were listed were containment,
yes,
AKA don't let the Soviet Union dominate the Middle East, oil, and the state of Israel as a special case for a variety of reasons, which we've talked about before. I
yeah,
think you could probably just sub the Soviet Union for Iran today for the first
hmm,
one. And then since the end of the Cold War, you've added counterterrorism and counterproliferation.
hmm.
We'll have to see where things go with US Israeli relations, but that one is certainly less of a bipartisan consensus than it used to be.
Interestingly, the Israelis have started to make noises about not wanting or needing American aid anymore. What do you make of that?
I don't buy it at all.
I think it's a tactic. Yeah.
Yeah. I, I don't buy it for a second.
Yeah.
um,
It is interesting though.
yeah.
To like try to get
Um,
ahead of that.
yeah. So I just, I don't buy it.
Yeah.
We'll have to see where things go with that. If the hydrocarbon world shifts, we'll see where things go with that. Counterterrorism, I feel like we've been having a debate since 9/11 as to whether these military operations are counterproductive when it comes to that issue.
Yeah.
Counterproliferation one in some ways has become like the biggest one.
Yep.
And unfortunately, I think the war has not achieved that goal. But zooming out at the global level, my own view is that like the US probably would have been fine and still probably can be fine, but it needs to stop scoring a bunch of own goals.
That would be good.
Like,
Yeah. That would be really good.
um, this is like another terrible sports analogy, so I apologize in advance, but this was back like when Tiger Woods was first becoming a big deal. It was like all these people being like, how do you beat this guy? And the answer is always like, you don't. You just let him beat himself, right? Like
And indeed he did.
that was like, yes, not in the way that they intended, but yeah.
Kind of
Uh,
self-destructed, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's like I kind of view things globally in the same way. Like the US reacted to 9/11 by getting bogged down in several major wars. It has recently done its damn best to alienate every one of its allies.
Hmm.
And even if you have question about the values of some of those alliances, and you wanted to kind of alter how they were structured, this is not the way to have gone about it.
Hmm.
And then something I worry about a lot is like the United States doesn't pay its bills anymore. It hasn't for some time. So like,
We'll talk about that eventually. Maybe we'll
yeah, but
get.
like, even as big a deal as this war has been, I do think the United States is a powerful enough country. And you look at its assets, right? Like geography, about as favorable geography as any great power that has ever existed, even as it tries to systematically undermine relations with its friendly northern neighbor. It has an enormous economy. The country is awash in wealth. I think like the net worth of the United States, like $120 trillion or something like
We're
that.
also outgrowing everybody still,
Yeah.
in the developed world at least.
Yeah. And we have a lot of infrastructure in place, which again, we are kind of undermining in some ways but when it comes to science and research and technology, extremely good at that. It has a lot of assets. But frankly, I think the thing to worry about is like we have a dysfunctional political system that cannot solve the problems that we face and seems to be exacerbating them in many cases. And
Hmm.
I sort of thought back like 15 years ago, eventually things would get bad enough that we would have to correct that. Um,
Yeah.
but I no longer think there's necessarily
Well,
good reason to
yeah.
think that'll happen. So that makes,
Historically, yeah,
yeah,
you look at, you know, global powers and empires, and like one of two things tends to happen: reform or collapse, right? Like either can take a very long time. We can be on this glide path of like screwing up for decades, honestly, and kind of get away with it because of the aforementioned assets and strengths. But yeah, I don't think anybody is under the impression now, even people that live in the U.S. and are patriots and love the U.S. Like, things are going awesome and have been going awesome for a really long time, and they'll just keep being great. It's like I don't know that anybody believes that anymore. Everybody's aware of the issues. We just can't seem to do anything about it. Yeah, as far as global strategy goes and the global effects of this loss, you and I both think, and we mentioned this before, the Trump administration thinks, and the Biden administration and the Obama administration before that, we all think that the game is not going to be played in the Persian Gulf so much anymore. It's actually getting played in East Asia. That's where the priority is. And so I think it's important and incumbent upon us to take a look at the Iran war loss in that frame and ask the question, well, what effects does this have on East Asia? What effects does this have on our sort of competitive relationship with China in particular? And what effects does it have on our allies in East Asia? Because they've all been watching this go down. They've been watching our military performance and Iran's military performance. They've been watching their energy prices spike as a result of this. They're not happy about that. They're also not necessarily happy to, like, especially our allies, they're not happy to watch us use all of our precision munitions and interceptors on
Yeah.
Iran instead of China if China decides to invade Taiwan, right, in the next couple of months or year, which we think is probably pretty unlikely, but could totally happen, right, Galen? So,
Look, I'll set up kind of like two foils of how many people think about this, and
yeah.
then I'll ask you where you come down. But like, there's a theory that what we're talking about fundamentally right now is credibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
The credibility of the United States to uphold its commitments and make good on its threats. And there is a whole school of thought out there that the way credibility works is that everything is interconnected. All right. So this became especially important during, when the nuclear age was getting underway. Nuclear threats notoriously difficult to make credible. So credibility is the coin of the realm, right? And in a certain sense, like that's what the Vietnam War is about.
Domino theory, right?
So like you don't hold up this commitment, like you'll get challenged elsewhere. So even though South Vietnam in and of itself isn't a huge, piece of the strategic chessboard, like it has massive ramifications for even key places like Western Europe, right? And then there's a theory out there of like differentiated credibility, right? And like what you did before doesn't necessarily affect how your opponents are thinking how you might act in other circumstances, right? So like Barack Obama said this a few times when he was criticized about the Syrian red line controversy, sort of questioning whether that's how a country like Russia really operates is, oh, you didn't make good on that threat, so now I'll invade Crimea, for example.
Right.
You saw this, by the way, in the debate over the Ukraine war. Like, you better help Ukraine because if you don't, like, Taiwan's going to be next. All right.
Right.
I am much more in like the differentiated credibility camp, which I think that term came from Elbridge Colby's book, which we talked about on the show before, which is like, I think what matters much more is like what things look like around the Taiwan Straits specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think if you're Xi Jinping, you're probably thinking, again, I agree with you, probably not going to invade Taiwan in the next few months, but that things are more favorable for you than they were 4 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you are a U.S. ally like South Korea and you have seen air defense assets redirected to the Persian Gulf,
Mm-hmm.
you're not thinking to yourself, awesome, like, what a show of U.S. resolve. I think you're like, no, we need those here.
Especially when it, like, we burn those and fail to accomplish anything. That's even worse, right?
Yeah. So to me, it's a fascinating debate because I think it's extremely difficult to prove one way or another. And I think it's just context dependent for the most part,
Yeah.
which is sort of why I think like, when the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam, I don't think any of U.S. adversaries were like, oh no, or sorry, we're like, this is, like, I think they probably thought it was bad for them. They would much rather have the U.S. be bogged down and diverting resources in that theater. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you can flip this on its head and be like, okay, I'm South Korea. I watched this go down. I'm not happy for some reasons, but on the other hand, the U.S. just fought Iran and tried to protect its allies. Like, it came
Yeah.
to, and it did so preemptively, and it demonstrated a lot of military capability. And importantly, not only do we have military capability, like, we actually used it. So one of the things we talked about with China is like, yeah, China's threatening Taiwan. China hasn't fought a war for decades, and like doesn't seem to have anybody with any warfighting experience. It's like, yeah, like we're not doing a good job in terms of choosing what to fight over and how to do it. But in terms of like the actual operations of striking targets, like we got very good at that. So if I'm an ally, I actually like to see that. It's like, oh, you guys have the tools and like you know how to use them. You you just don't know where or when or why to use them, you know?
Yeah,
So
on the other hand, like China got to watch too, right? And learn
yes,
all about US doctrine and
that's why this is complicated. It's like there's pluses and minuses in both columns, right? So
yeah, I I guess I'm just saying like if this is an L, I guess the debate for I think you and I both think it's an L. The
it's
kind
an
of
L.
to think about is like how big of an L.
How big of an L? Yeah.
Like I don't think it's a rock. I don't think it's as devastating as
Yeah.
that. But like if you're South Korea or Japan or the Philippines or Australia or whatever, like I don't think if you're banking on US deterrence and military support that watching a country like Iran, which is not nearly the power that China is, fight the US to a standstill or even improve its bargaining position. I don't think that's
Great.
something you want to see.
It's not, but on the other hand, or the tactical circumstances are completely different in terms of what Iran needed to
That's
accomplish
true.
in order to win and what China would need to accomplish in order to win.
Yeah.
You know, China would need to successfully coerce or invade Taiwan. That's a bigger order than keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed and launching drones and missiles at the neighborhood. You know, that's a very complicated operation, and it puts the Chinese in a state of vulnerability. Which is not to say that Iran was not in a state of vulnerability. Like we kicked the daylights out of them and hurt them very badly, just not badly enough, right? Because they're playing defense. In this circumstance, we would be helping the rest of the neighborhood play defense, which is a kind of a different situation. Now, we were again, this is important. We were not able to play 100% defense against Iran. We were able to play, 90%, 95% defense. So that's a very important finding. If I'm a U.S. ally in East Asia, it's like, well, if the Chinese start using drones and ballistic missiles, and they have plenty of both,
Yeah.
and probably more sophisticated versions than the Iranians do, like, what are we going to do about that? You know? Um,
Yeah. I mean, zooming back out on that, this is like the big question, I guess, for me at the root of all of this. It's like if you take 1956 as like analogously like a solvency crisis
mhm.
for Britain and France, or like a lack of, for lack of a better term, power, right? Like they
Wherewithal.
did not
Yeah.
have the capabilities to do it. Neither
Yeah.
you or I think that applies to the United States in 2026.
Not
Like
yet.
in
Yeah.
terms of the capabilities it currently has, and even more importantly, the potential it has to have even better capabilities and improve its position going forward, which is to say it's like a political problem.
Yes.
I guess something that does worry me is like, does the rest of the world stop giving the United States chances going forward? Right? Like,
Well, what's their alternative, right? So that's one question. And if I'm Japan and South Korea and Australia, there aren't any. Straight up, it's like they can't do it by themselves. I don't
yeah,
think so. They don't have a choice. Number one. Number two, you see this because these countries are still underwriting the United States. Japanese are still investing in U.S. debt. The Koreans and everybody else, right? The Taiwanese are building semiconductor fabs in the U.S. because all of these countries know that they need the U.S. and there is no alternative. They are not going to be able to balance by themselves. What this means, though, is that if it ever becomes clear that the U.S. no longer has the capability to put that finger on the scale and be like the key offshore balancer, then it'll be a punctuated equilibrium and everybody could go over to the other side very quickly. That's what I would say.
well, you said the wherewithal. What about the political will? Right? That's
Yes,
that's another issue. I mean,
that is another issue. That is another issue. So,
there we were already right, like ironically, given that he took us to war with Iran, but part of Trump's popularity and what accounts partially for his win in 2024 was his like America first. I'm not doing forever wars, especially in the Middle East. So there was already like some real, groundswell of support for that sort of thing. I do think like he has taken things with the Europeans further than a lot of people would have thought he would or desired,
Removing troops. Yeah.
but there certainly was like a sentiment among many people that like the Europeans don't pay their fair share. This is welfare for the rich. Like, why are so like, and this war is going to leave even more of a bad taste in Americans' mouth and probably contribute, as Iraq and Afghanistan did, to a reluctance to deploy U.S. military forces abroad even more.
I agree with that. Be that as it may, though, there is a major qualitative difference between won't do and can't do.
100%.
Because won't do, you can change your mind. And if there's one thing we know about the U.S., it's like we have still elections every 4 years. Leaders change their minds. Americans change their mind. Like, this is a thing that happens, right? If you can't do it, then it doesn't matter whether or not you change your mind. Then you just can't do it. And you're in the situation of Britain and France, where it's like you would like to keep projecting power. You would like to have an empire. You'd like to have these bases, but you can't do it. You can't afford it. You don't have enough people. That's it. Game's over. And the United States is not in that situation. And I think, like, at least for the foreseeable future, is not going to be in that situation, I would say.
Which I think you just nicely summed up, like why we both think this is not 1956, right?
No.
That was a can't thing.
Can't do
Britain
it.
and France, yes.
Yeah, can't do it. The U.S. is like, won't do it is kind of a problem. And there's also the inverse of that, which is will do it in the wrong place at the wrong time, which is what we just saw, right?
Well, and we have seen for a while now, I guess.
Yeah,
that's my concern.
Right. Yeah, and like we keep doing this in the Middle East for reasons that are not the best, perhaps, and the execution is not the best. And it's like, if I'm an ally, I don't like to see that, but it's still the case that we can do what we need to do in Europe and East Asia if we want to. And so it comes down to, do we want to? And in East Asia, it's like, there's the national security strategy, which is like, yes, we want to. We need to keep the Chinese within the first island chain, like very clear, right? And that's been very consistent. And if you are a international relations realist and you think that countries mostly all behave the same, the only real difference is how big and strong they are, right? And that dictates their behavior. Then it kind of makes sense that every American administration, regardless of political persuasion, has been consistently like, yes, we need to keep the Chinese bottled up in the first island chain. It's like, it doesn't matter what your ideology is. It's like, they're getting too big and we need to stop them, right?
Yeah.
And we'll probably just keep saying that. But, you have an idiosyncratic figure like President Trump who sometimes says other stuff. Weird. What do we make of that? And if I'm Japan or South Korea, it's like, I don't want to hear that. And certainly if I'm Taiwan.
There is one other key difference, which we've talked about, but bears repeating, on declaratory policy, right? Which is, I'm not exactly sure. I think it was first George W. Bush that said it, but whatever. The U.S. has had a consistent policy where every U.S. president since this became a factor has said Iran will not be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, right? That is a bipartisan, long-standing commitment going back to, at least 2002 or something like that. Taiwan is a long-standing, with the exception of 4 Biden statements, which were walked back, a long-standing bipartisan policy of strategic ambiguity, which Trump has returned to. And that is a question of will or won't, not of can't. And so in that sense, I don't know what you're thinking if you're like South Korea watching the Iran war, or even more to the point, Taiwan watching the Iran war, because that commitment has never been made totally clear.
And it will continue probably to not be made totally clear. And like I think you're right to frame what Trump has said as actually a return to the status quo rather than something other than that. No, he's returned to ambiguity
Yeah.
and a unwillingness to discuss what he would or wouldn't do, which is actually very consistent with the bulk of foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, historically in this
Yeah.
area. Biden represents a departure, and his administration departed from Biden when he said
Correct.
that stuff. Yeah,
Almost immediately.
yeah. It's like,
It's,
oh no, never mind. Strike that from the record. Yeah. So
I
will
mean,
or won't.
I'll put a bow on my comments by saying, like, in general, I tend to think things are never as good or as bad as they seem.
That's a
Uh,
good policy.
and I think that there is still, this is not a point that I have come up with. Many people have made it, but like, if you're the United States and, you know, in my lifetime, you were like the greatest power since like the Roman Empire,
Hmm.
you have enormous leeway to make a lot of really bad mistakes, which probably makes it more likely that you will.
And we have,
Uh,
yeah.
but like, that also means you get a lot of chances to correct for those.
Hmm.
No, I don't view 1956 as even remotely useful as a comparison, because I think the United States is just not anywhere near in the position Britain and France were at that time.
Yeah.
Uh, but this is a major development, the Iran war, which I think the US is going to be dealing with the consequences of for some time. And I do think there will come a time where like the US needs to get its house in order,
Hmm.
where things are going to look very badly. But I don't think we're there just yet.
I agree with that. I think this is a big deal and a bad loss for the U.S. I don't think it's well. How bad is it really? I don't think it's a catastrophe. I've called it a disaster recently on this show. Yeah, maybe that's a little strong. It's a clear loss in terms of like long range strategic implications. I don't know. I don't see the Iranians dominating the region. Israel's still there. Saudi's still there. We'll be there one way or another. What this means, though, is that we're just going to have to do business with these guys. And that's distasteful. But like everybody wants to export hydrocarbons still from the Middle East, including the Iranians. Like they need to. So that part of it, at least, should eventually return to some equilibrium. And I agree. I personally think that the U.S. still has opportunities to fix what ails it, and I think that the U.S. is more likely than most countries to be able to do that. Does it mean that it will? No, no. Inevitably, sooner or later, countries fail. They fall apart. They lose whatever made them great, and they run out of steam. They run out of juice. Sometimes it's often because of inequality and accrual of political power to certain groups. Could be due to environmental reasons, corruption. We're dealing with all of these things, right? It doesn't mean that it's a done deal for the U.S. I think the U.S. still has opportunities and chances to get this right, but we are kind of getting into like maybe the yellow zone or the orange zone at this point. And the Iran war just takes us a little bit further into that zone. It's less margin. It's
And I
the way I would
guess,
characterize this.
yeah, the last thing I'll say is like, more than China, more than Iran, more than pick whatever your favorite US adversary is to be worried about. My worry has much more to do with like how Americans like start having some political unity and solving some of the big political problems that have ailed us for many, many years now. And, I'd love to say I was optimistic that we would be able to do that. But unfortunately, like pretty much my entire adult life has provided me evidence that that's not happening. So that's my real concern, is that
Yeah.
to right the ship, so to speak, we're going to have to fix some of those problems, and those seem like pretty wicked problems in some cases. But
They are wicked problems, but like American politics has a thermostatic quality
yeah, that's true too.
over the short, medium, and long terms, and I think we're in like some kind of the end of some long-term cycle. And I think it is more like it is certainly not impossible that things continue to spiral out of control, but I think it is more likely than not that we get a movement back towards equilibrium. And yeah, maybe like you can come back, but you can't come back all the way. I think that's a Bob Dylan lyric, right?
Mhm.
Maybe we don't come back all the way, but it's like we come back to like 90% of where we were or 85%. It's like that's still really good and probably the best in the world. So, yeah, the Roman Empire had multiple golden ages over the course of a very long time.
I'll defer to you. I heard from someone that there was like a whole thing on the internet of like, how often do you as a dude think about the Roman Empire? And I was like,
2.5 times a day, and that was
I was like, never.
I'm moving towards quota today. All right, should we leave it there?
Yeah, let's do that.
Awesome. All right, this has been another episode of Global Tantrum. Thanks everybody. Peace.